a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Welcome to another interview episode of TEFLology, this time featuring a chat with Dr. Anna Siyanova. Dr. Siyanova works at Victoria University of Wellington, and her research interests include cognitive and psychological aspects of second language acquisition. In addition, Dr. Siyanova investigates the acquisition and use of multi-word expressions. Matt met up with her recently before a lecture she gave at a university in Tokyo.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today. Perhaps just to start, maybe you could introduce yourself, maybe your teaching and research experience.
Well, my main research area is in the area of vocabulary, and specifically I research multi-word expressions.
Right.
And this encompasses all sorts of different chunks, units, phrases, whatever term you prefer. So for instance, I research idioms, collocations, lexical bundles, binomials, things like kick the bucket, king and queen, as a matter of fact. So things that we intuitively perceive as chunks.
Right.
And I research these multi-word expressions from a number of different perspectives. Specifically, I'm interested in how native speakers and language learners produce them, use them in their written discourse.
Right, I see.
I'm also interested in how beginner learners versus intermediate learners versus advanced learners use them in their, for instance, written discourse. So this is an area that I would call learner corpus research.
Right.
L2 writing. I also research multi-word expressions from a more psycholinguistic perspective. How we process, how we comprehend, how we produce multi-word expressions. And I use psycholinguistic techniques for that, to see whether there is a, for instance, processing advantage of something very frequent and something very conventional and chunk-like versus something propositional, novel. I'm also interested in how good we are in estimating multi-word expression frequency.
Right.
So another strand of my research is multi-word expressions and native speaker and learner intuitions.
Right.
So how good we are at, I guess, guessing frequencies or using the appropriate kind of multi-word expression. Versus something frequent versus something infrequent.
Yeah.
So this is my research in a nutshell.
I see. Okay. So what made you become first interested, or maybe first see the importance of multi-word expressions?
I guess the fact that traditionally we, as learners, we're taught words and rules, and as teachers we teach words and rules. But we now know that language is not merely using rules with words and using rules to put words together. One of the examples I gave at my lecture is we say good morning, and we always say good morning. We don't say fine or pleasant or enjoyable morning. That's how we greet someone.
Right, I see.
We tend to offer someone a cup of tea and never a mug of tea. No matter what you have at home, mugs or cups or something else.
Right.
These are just conventional chunks that we tend to use as chunks. We do not think necessarily that we're putting word 1 with word 2. We just use it as a chunk because it's how we're used to saying things. We do not alter any of the 2 words or 3 words within the phrase, even though we could easily do that. We could easily say, would you like a mug of tea as opposed to a cup of tea? So we do not use rules when we produce these chunks.
Right, I see. So it's kind of learnt more as routine, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. We tend to learn language as constructions. We do not necessarily learn words and rules. We learn constructions, all sorts of constructions. These could be lexical constructions or grammatical constructions. So if I say this is a bottle, these are bottles, it's still construction.
Yeah, I see.
So these could be greetings and farewells and proverbs and idioms and collocations and constructions. And these do not necessarily need to be figurative chunks.
Right.
So we know that idioms are the most quintessential example of multi-word expressions. We all recognize them as chunks, but multi-word expressions, many of them are compositional.
Yeah.
Many of them are compositional, so they are equally chunk-like.
Right.
Akin to idioms.
Yeah, I see. And you, in your talk, perhaps I'm correct, you mentioned 4 properties of multi-word expressions: familiarity, frequency, predictability, and fixedness. And I wonder if you could kind of unpack those a little bit, what they mean exactly.
Well, most multi-word expressions are quite frequent.
Yeah.
There are exceptions, but that's what makes them chunk-like. That's what makes them interesting and relatively easily recognizable. They're quite frequent. And frequency leads to familiarity. So if something is frequent, we recognize it as familiar in a language. But as I also mentioned in my talk, some chunks are familiar, but not necessarily very frequent if we look at number of occurrences in a corpus.
I see, yeah.
So for instance, raining cats and dogs is very, very familiar, but it's rather infrequent in the sense that native speakers do not use it an awful lot, and we only can find a few occurrences in the British National Corpus, which is about 100 million words. I also talked about predictability.
Right.
So again, frequency and familiarity lead to predictability.
Yeah.
Our language is highly predictable. I can say, for instance, too many cooks, and I can just pause here because you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't need to finish the phrase because you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's this predictability aspect of multi-word expressions. That's what makes language comprehension and production easier if we operate with a rich repertoire of multi-word expressions.
Yeah, I see.
If we had to construct our entire discourse from novel prepositional utterances, it would be rather slow and harder for me to produce and for you to comprehend, because that's the language you hear for the first time in your life.
Yeah.
Whereas now I'm operating with, I'm saying lots of chunks you have heard many times in your life, and you will hear many more times, and it's easier for you to understand, and it's easier for me to produce.
I see. So so I guess many different modes of English aren't as unplanned and original as they seem.
Absolutely,
perhaps.
absolutely. Unless you are trying to be original, unless you're a poet, unless you are writing something, unless you are a creative writer, or you're using a novel metaphor, much of what we produce on a daily basis is formulaic, prefabricated, something that we have produced many times before and will produce many times again.
Yeah. In terms of, you mentioned frequency and familiarity being important properties of multi-word expressions. How does this relate to the teaching of maybe a new expression, for example? I believe Professor Schmidt talks about the noticing hypothesis. So do you think that the more that the students are exposed at the beginning to these expressions, they can maybe, I'm going to say, acquire quicker, perhaps?
Absolutely. The more you're exposed to something, the higher the chances that you'll acquire it, that you'll learn it, that you'll notice it in your subsequent input, and you'll use it in your language production. Of course, we need to focus, at least initially, on some of the most frequent multi-word expressions. Given that, for instance, classroom time is limited, there have been a number of lists of multi-word expressions. Some of the most common multi-word expressions, for instance, used in spoken discourse or in academic discourse. So initially, the most frequent ones, those that perhaps learners and teachers should focus on.
Okay.
But going back to your question about frequency and repetition, yes, these are fundamental to how we learn a language, and that applies to first language learning and second language learning. Our language learning is statistical. We notice occurrences, we register them, and that's how we use the language, how we use I'm not being particularly original in my speech now because A, there's no need, and B, I haven't. Normally, the language I produce is something I have heard before, so
right,
it's the result of my exposure to certain chunks, certain structures.
I see. Yeah. How can we help our learners become aware that language is of this nature? And I think a lot of learners come into the classroom expecting something new or something different from their L1 perhaps, but how would you draw parallels with their L1?
I'm not sure it's always helpful I'm not sure it's helpful to draw parallels with the L1. It is quite important to draw learners' attention to the presence of so many multi-word expressions in discourse in general. The question is how do you do that? When it comes to things like idioms, yes, they're so salient. The learner knows it's something that is used figuratively.
Right.
But the trouble with multi-word expressions is that there are so many of them, and many of them are completely not salient. They do not stand out. They're not figurative, and yet they're very important to learn and to use by second language learners.
Yeah.
So I guess it's partly the role of the teacher to draw their attention to the presence of so many multi-word expressions.
Yeah.
And we know that there are techniques such as textual enhancement, for instance.
Right.
Frank Boris at the Victoria University of Wellington, he's done some research on whether underlining or some other textual enhancement helps learners with multi-word expressions.
Right.
And particularly, Frank Boris has also worked on things like alliteration or rhyme, whether it helps if a learner is made aware of an alliterative pattern or rime or assonance
right. I see,
in a multi-word expression.
Yeah. I guess a lot of communicative language teaching these days is very meaning focused. So do you think there's a place for more kind of form focused approaches to language teaching, more of a focus on the actual expressions themselves as kind of very explicitly learnt forms, perhaps?
I think there's probably place for everything. It's I guess striking striking right balance between the two.
Yeah, I see. And in your talk, you mentioned the kind of a dichotomy between native speakers and non-native speakers. I'm wondering how kind of world Englishes kind of comes into this argument too, perhaps, and if there's any. Well, first of all, are there any corpora that deal with world Englishes and multi-word expressions, perhaps?
I guess if you're conducting a study and you want to look at the difference between natives and non-natives, you can either use this dichotomy or you can potentially classify your learners as highly proficient or slightly less proficient.
Right,
you can ask them
to
rate their proficiency in some way, or use their EyeTracking or TEFL score, and potentially look at the continuum of of proficiency, where at one end you have native speakers, at the other you have perhaps the less proficient non-natives, and and other non-native speakers somewhere in the middle of this continuum. So there are, I guess, depends whether you are conducting a study or doing something else.
Right.
So in my own research, I used this dichotomy, natives versus non-natives, and I also looked at this continuum of proficiency, because of course some information is lost if you are looking at this dichotomy, because we know that non-native speakers range massively. Vary massively in their proficiency, more and less proficient.
In your talk you gave an example about what you said earlier about a cup of tea and a mug of tea, and maybe mug of tea is we still understand the meaning. I'm wondering if there's any kind of trends in multi-word expressions that have kind of evolved with communication between two second language speakers of English, and is there enough occurrences to suggest that this might be a new variety emerging, perhaps?
Well, it depends on the aim of. It depends what the learner eventually wants to achieve. If they want to be native-like, that's one thing. If they want to be, if they want to understand and be understood, then certainly saying a mug of tea will not lead to a breakdown in the conversation.
Right, I see.
So if you want to become as native-like as possible, which is perhaps not really the aim of most learners.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
From my personal second language learning experience, I don't particularly want to acquire language, and come across as a native speaker. I still want to preserve my identity and perhaps come across as a proficient non-native speaker of the languages that I'm familiar with. So I guess it depends. I guess it depends. But you're right. If something occurs many times, it will eventually become perhaps conventional or appropriate in a particular context.
Yeah, I see. And I think you also mentioned in your talk that learners will naturally gravitate to less lexically dense expressions than the longer ones, perhaps, or the less familiar ones. So I guess in terms of studying corpus, have you seen any drops in certain expressions and increases in other expressions?
I see what you mean. Yes, I think one of the most commonly cited findings in learner corpus research is that learners tend to underuse some expressions and overuse others, and perhaps misuse something else.
I see, yeah.
A few researchers have looked at phrasal processing, at the use of phrasal verbs in learner writing.
Right.
And we know that if a particular learner doesn't have phrasal verbs in their first language, they may be underusing them in their second language, in English.
Right, I see.
So phrasal verbs can potentially be underused by many learners, particularly if their first language doesn't have phrasal verbs. Some multi-word expressions are overused. I'm not sure I can give you an example off the top of my head, but yes, there's certainly this pattern of underuse, overuse, and misuse in learner writing.
I see.
Compared to the native speaker data, of course.
Yeah, I see. I guess when a teacher is kind of planning a lesson, they'll naturally choose maybe expressions that they're familiar with. Do you think this is a good way to go about planning a lesson, perhaps, thinking from your experience, or do you think teachers maybe should refer to corpora data, perhaps?
Yes, I do think that it's a good idea to use corpora to choose what to focus on, and to choose the most frequent, the most useful phrases. There are, of course, a number of issues with that. For some languages, there are no corpora available.
Right.
So when it comes to English, yes, we have quite a few corpora that we can use in language teaching, but many languages don't have good corpora. Also, language teachers need to be aware of the presence of the existence of language corpora.
Yeah, sure.
And they need perhaps need to know how to extract, how to use corpora. Of course, we have frequency lists. We know which words are more useful, which words are more frequent. Same applies to phrases. Right. I do think that most teachers can use their intuition in their language teaching and choose perhaps what they think useful, what they think more useful. But they can also make use of corpora. I think there's certainly a place for corpora in language teaching.
Yeah.
And we know that from many empirical studies that we cannot trust our intuitions 100%.
Right.
And this applies to trained linguists. This applies to language teachers who are native speakers. This applies to teachers who are non-native speakers. We cannot trust our intuitions 100%.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Perhaps I'd like to ask you a bit about the kind of the pedagogical roles of multi-word expressions, or how teachers can go about helping their learners to maybe first notice these expressions and then get them using them as soon as possible. Is there one definitive way? Or?
No, unfortunately, there is no one definitive way, and I think the truth is that we don't really know for sure how it's best to teach multi-word expressions and how it's best for learners to learn multi-word expressions.
Right, sure.
There have been there have been a few techniques. For instance, we know that if, as I mentioned earlier, if you enhance phrases textually, then this may lead to noticing.
Right, yeah.
We know that if you draw learners' attention to some phonological patterns such alliteration or assonance or rhyme, then this may lead to retention.
Right.
We also know that if something occurs many times in the input, this will lead to potentially to retention. But as studies have shown, we need to expose the learner to many occurrences.
Right.
A few times will not help. We're talking about 10, 15 and more occurrences. And even then there are no guarantees that the learner will learn these expressions.
Yeah.
But ultimately we can use a combination of all of these approaches because no approach is perfect.
Yeah.
And empirical studies show that even if you draw learners' attention to some phonological patterns, even if you repeat, even if you make sure that there are enough repetitions in the learner's input, we still do not get 100% retention rate.
I see, in your talk you mentioned the, I guess, the psycholinguistic properties of multi-word expressions, and you showed an example of a stroke victim. And although she was, I guess, her first language was English, she in the video you showed, she seemed to retain certain expressions more than vocabulary, perhaps. I'm wondering, is this kind of an argument towards using more of these multi-word expressions, perhaps?
Yes, definitely. As you mentioned in the video, the patient struggled to produce novel prepositional speech, but was quite capable of producing some frequent multi-word expressions quite fluently. And in fact, if you only listen to those chunks that she produced in the video, she was pretty fluent, but she was not unable to produce a novel phrase fluently or hardly at all. So I guess this just again shows that multi-word expressions are important and frequent, and they help you appear more fluent.
Yeah.
So if you're a second language learner, particularly at the beginning of your language learning process, using multi-word expressions may help you appear more fluent.
Okay, right.
Because we use them as chunks. We don't need to think, okay, here I put the subject, here I put the verb, here I put the object. You can kind of use them as a chunk.
Yeah.
You don't need to think of putting how to put the 2 or 3 or 4 words together.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, certainly from my own experience, the Japanese language is very formulaic, and there's a number of kind of phrases that are used at that time for that purpose. So for me, that kind of, it helps my learning of Japanese. Do you think there's some risks with learning multi-word expressions? I guess that's my question. Are there any risks? I guess it falls between rules and routine. Is there any kind of conflict between the two?
I'm not sure that there are risks, but perhaps relying on multi-word expressions explicitly should be could possibly be different, say, for beginner learners and for advanced learners.
Okay, yeah.
So multi-word expressions help you appear more fluent, and this is particularly important for beginner learners.
Yeah.
More advanced learners, they are well capable of producing a novel prepositional piece of discourse,
right,
and they may use multi-word expressions to appear more native-like, again for fluency. Whenever you need to produce something like as a matter of fact, or as far as I know, and things like this. But they're also well capable of producing prepositional speech.
Right.
So I guess there is a danger in terms of over-relying on them and just producing lots of formulaic expressions and not really getting to the point because you're lacking the actual prepositional speech.
Yeah.
But most advanced learners, I think, are perfectly capable of producing coherent discourse where there's a balance between prepositional and formulaic.
I see, yeah. Maybe going back a couple of points ago, you mentioned different ways researchers can find out what perhaps what the learners are using, perhaps. And one of the methods was eye-tracking. This is something new to me, so I wonder if you could maybe tell me a little bit about the eye-tracking method of research.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are many ways you can approach multi-word expression research. One of them is a psycholinguistic research. And because multi-word expressions are frequent and familiar and predictable, it's a good idea to use a method that can investigate this frequency and predictability mechanisms. So eye-tracking is a method that allows you to track someone's eye movements and to see exactly what they're looking at, for how long, and importantly for multi-word expressions, whether something can be skipped. So in my early examples, too many cooks, essentially you don't need to hear or to read the end of the chunk to be able to understand the meaning. So in reading, we're interested in whether you skip the entire phrase or the end of the phrase entirely. And eye tracking allows you to do precisely that. You can see what is skipped, what is perhaps read faster. Because if something is frequent and predictable, presumably you don't need to read it as well as, for instance, something novel and propositional.
I see, yeah.
So eye tracking allows you to investigate how long it took you to read something, whether you had any particular strategies, whether you were skipping highly frequent, highly predictable phrases given the immediate discourse to the left and to the right of the word. And you can do it in the first language and in the second language, perhaps to compare more or less proficient readers.
Right, I see. Yeah. And this would be done in a laboratory or in the classroom?
Yes, you would definitely need a laboratory, and you would do one person at a time.
I see, okay.
So normally the researcher would, or a research assistant would put an eye tracker on the person's head. There are many different eye trackers. I personally have used head-mounted eye trackers.
Right, okay.
And you would ensure that the camera is all set up and kind of trained to calibrate, trained to track your eye movements. It needs to be calibrated, it needs to be set up properly, because we all have different eyes and different different shapes, different colors, and it all matters. And when the person reads, the camera tracks the eye movements, and we get the result is lots of data, very rich data. We can have a look at fixations. So when you read, you make lots of fixations. Every time you pause for some milliseconds on the word, that's a fixation. And fixations are connected by jumps, which we call saccades. And if a word is low frequency or a long word, you can spend more time reading it. You can make more fixations. If something is highly frequent or very short, you can read it really fast, or you can skip the word altogether.
I see.
And if something is highly predictable, given the preceding context, essentially you can skip the word altogether because it's highly predictable.
I see. So this would be done purely with written English, or
you can you can
reading.
You can conduct a reading experiment. You can also conduct an experiment with pictures or images, or could be some sort of a mixture of images and audio input. So there are many possibilities, but in the field of second language acquisition, we're interested in how learners read text. But definitely you can conduct an experiment with audio-visual presentation, with images or text. There are different paradigms you can use.
Is there anything similar with spoken English?
Yes, for instance, you could, as in similar.
I guess you can't really do eye tracking with spoken English.
You could have audio input through the headphones.
I see.
And you could, for instance, investigate how learners comprehend idioms. So some idioms could be used both figuratively and literally. We call these ambiguous idioms. For instance, kick the bucket could be used literally and figuratively. Of course, the most frequent meaning is to die, the figurative meaning. But you could potentially present a learner with two images, one reflecting kick the bucket used literally and the other one used figuratively.
Yeah.
And provide some sort of a spoken audio input through the headphones.
I see.
And see what they look at. And if first the learner looks at, say, the literal interpretation of this phrase, it means that perhaps for them the literal interpretation is more frequent, more salient.
Right.
Or perhaps they're simply not familiar with the idiom.
I see. Yeah.
So you could conduct a reading experiment or an experiment with images and with the audio presentation.
I see. Yeah. Perhaps just one final question, slightly different. In terms of pragmatics, I think you used a quote in your talk. So multi-word expressions are verbal means for conventional actions. I think that was by Kulmas, right? Kulmas, perhaps. I guess what problem? I guess multi-word expressions could have a number of functions and pragmatics. Perhaps how would you connect the two? I guess between actual form and function, perhaps.
Well, some multi-word expressions essentially don't have a meaning as such. We use them to signal perhaps the relationship with a person, to express sympathy, perhaps solidarity.
Right.
So we, particularly in English, there's lots of hedging.
Hedging, right.
We also tend to use. Perhaps certain multi-word expressions just to maintain the discourse rather than to actually communicate particular information.
Okay, I see, yeah.
So we can, for instance, you just said, I see. It's not necessarily full of content, but you kind of, you showed your, understand what I'm saying, you kind of show that you are following me, you are listening to me, you are being attentive. So you can say, oh, I know what you mean, I see. So all these little things, they're not really full of context, but they help me see that you are with me, you are not, you're paying attention to what I'm saying.
I see. Yeah.
So these little things can kind of help me speak because I see your interest in what I'm saying.
I see.
So if I'm talking to a language learner who is not saying, oh, I see what you mean, I see, oh, that's interesting, kind of, if we're not using these little things, then perhaps I lose interest because I see that you are not particularly interested in what I'm saying, because you're not expressing any kind of solidarity or any interest in what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm really aware of my reactions now, actually. So I guess focusing on that, Okay, well, perhaps we'll leave it there, but it's been really enjoyable interview, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your interest in my work and in multi-word expressions in general.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the interview with Dr. Siyanova. As usual, if you enjoyed the episode, we'd love to hear from you. And even if you didn't, we'd love to hear some comments and or questions. Please email us at teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. Thanks.